Hello and welcome to this Gallery Teachers Masterclass. Today our topic is speaking. I'm a teacher trainer and director of marketing at CELT Cardiff. My context currently is a small private language school teaching both juniors and adults, groups and individuals. But over the years, I've worked in many contexts, in many roles in English language teaching, and I've also been a speaking examiner. So I hope I will be able, in sharing my experiences and my thoughts about teaching speaking, to give you some fresh ideas about how we can go about teaching speaking successfully. In terms of today's workshop, we're going to begin by actually questioning what actually is a speaking class. I'll then look at some of the speaking skills exams that exists within the context of the Cambridge exams in order to suggest how these can help us to think very clearly about what makes a purposeful speaking lesson, or indeed a purposeful speaking class and course. And we'll then move on to look at a nice little tool that is available, which will help you to think about what you could include when developing either an individual lesson or a whole program of speaking classes. And I'll then draw some conclusions at the end. So I'd like to begin by really asking the key question is, well, what is a speaking class? And conversely, what isn't a speaking class? And I'd like to do this by introducing you to three students. And here they are, Yumiko, Elodie, and Francesca. Now, their context is a private language school. It could be anywhere in the world. And they're particularly interested in developing their speaking. However, don't worry. If your context is a state institution, a secondary school, a primary school, or a university, the points that I'm making remain the same. So our three friends here clearly are looking forward to developing their speaking. And they've therefore enrolled, because it's available in their context, on a Cambridge exams program. But as I say, it could be anywhere. And they're particularly keen to improve their speaking and therefore have chosen specifically a speaking skills class as an afternoon option. But as I've said, maybe you do things differently. Maybe in your context, speaking is integrated into a series of lessons at any time in the day. Maybe you don't have an elective optional afternoon speaking program. Don't worry. Everything I'm going to be talking about is directly relevant to whenever you are speaking, teaching speaking. So in terms of their classroom activities, the teacher, working with our three friends, decides to provide them with a range of interesting speaking activities. And I've chosen these as these are speaking activities, two of which I've already taught, and the third one I'd love to teach at some point in the future. And the context here is general English. The first one is a negotiation. It's about things that that people can do if they go on a holiday together. And they have to, working with their partner, decide what they want to do. The second task you may well be familiar with. It's the famous NASA survival task, developed by NASA in order to choose astronauts, but now, for example, used at high levels. This particular task used to exist in a proficiency coursebook. And the students have a discussion in a group about which of these different things they want to take with them to the moon and to rank them in order. It is effectively a ranking task. Now, my third activity is based, and it's a very popular speaking activity, is based around a song. This is based around the new ABBA release. And as you'll be aware, ABBA will be appearing in concert. Lots of people are talking about it. And they will be appearing, in fact, as not just avatars, but avatars. So I'm thinking in terms of developing a speaking class where you might, for example, have a gap fill, followed by a discussion talking about the benefits and possibly also some of the risks of working and living in a virtual world with holograms, or as ABBA are calling them, because they're more sophisticated now, their avatars. So there we go. Those are our speaking activities, and good news, our 3 students really enjoy participating in them. But of course, as we know, enjoyment isn't enough. To be successful, we have to have a clear purpose in our speaking classes, and indeed in all of our speaking classes. And that's where design of the lesson becomes important in terms of the teacher, when planning the class, knowing exactly what she or he wants to achieve. Now, in terms of when we ask teachers what they think about in terms of what makes a good speaker, what we have on screen here are some of the most common answers. And absolutely rightly so, because if we look at, for example, the IELTS speaking criteria, grammar and vocabulary are important, good pronunciation is important, and the organization, the cohesion and the coherence of the speech utterance is also examined. Of course, teachers of speaking will probably want to add things like fluency, register, and appropriacy. But I'm going to argue that, in fact, these are not necessarily, particularly the 4 points here, the most important things that we should be focusing on as our objectives in planning speaking classes. I would suggest that those 4 points are, if you like, the bedrock of linguistic development. They are just as important for writing as they are for speaking, and therefore arguably these should be focused on not in the speaking class but in the language development class, because in the speaking class we need time and we need as teachers to focus on other areas, and I'll show you these on screen now. So what we have is a series of linguistic areas which are specific in many ways to speaking, but often are overlooked in the speaking classroom. Of course, we want to work on the development of fluency, and there are many activities out there that we can do. But I would argue that very important for the development of purposeful speaking is the development of a functional range and an accurate use of those functions of speaking. And we're going to look at how to do that in this masterclass. I would also argue that it is important to develop interactional competence. And by that, I mean the ability for students to initiate, to start a discussion, to respect the cultural norms of turn-taking, to understand in a given context, it might be a group of students studying in America for immersion in an American university, or it might be a group of business people from different countries who will be working internationally. They all need to understand, A, what turn-taking is. In other words, speaker A followed by speaker B, going back to speaker A, and whether there are pauses between them speaking. So if we think about Japanese speakers of English, very often they will put a long pause after they're finished speaking to give the person they're speaking to time to listen to and respect what they're saying. Whereas an Italian might culturally think it's acceptable to overlap with the other person. And until you have developed an understanding of these cultural norms, but also considered what is the norm that is appropriate for the students you're teaching, then they may well find difficulty in sounding natural and being able to participate in speaking in the real world. And of course, there is also this point about directing, taking the conversation in a particular direction that you want to follow. And therefore also things like changing subject or coming back to something that was said earlier, all of which have linguistic elements to them. Plus, of course, that important skill that if you are not quite sure what someone said, you know how to check. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Could you say that again? Or repair strategies. If you've said something and it's not going well, you maybe realize that you lack vocabulary or the grammar, the ability to nevertheless continue with the message, but in other words. So my big point today is this: speaking skills classes should really be focusing on everything that's here in blue. That's not to say the areas in grey don't matter, but potentially these should have less of a focus in a speaking skills class. Let me show you why. Now, this slide is here because it represents the fact that there is so much I could have chosen to speak about today in terms of developing the speaking skill. And necessarily, I've had to look at what I think are the key areas, but also the key areas to be wary of. So what I am discussing is, I absolutely accept a drop in the ocean, but nevertheless, I think an important one. So what I want to say is that it is really important to understand that in those speaking classes that were undertaken by our friends, that they are well aware, and the teacher is well aware of what they should attend to after the students have finished their activity. And to make this point clearer, I've taken from Hedge and her 2000 book methodology text, a quote from two coursebook authors, Hopkins and Potter. And they said back in 2000, and I quote, "Learners need to develop a knowledge of grammar, vocabulary, functional language, and communicative skills. Attention to the systems of language is crucial." That was everything that you saw in grey. But the development of fluency and contextual appropriacy are equally important goals. Well, I'm going to suggest that possibly they are more important, as is everything in blue. So, coming back to those activities that our three friends participated in, my question is, do they really help develop the speaking skill? And I think this really depends on how the teacher uses them. So in the context of that first activity, if the teacher uses it as an opportunity to give feedback on the student's use of the present perfect simple for talking about experiences, or uses it as an opportunity to focus on the vocabulary of the choices that the students were making for their activity, I think that's a lost option. It makes a speaking activity into a grammar activation or a vocabulary activation task. Likewise, the NASA survival simulation, if the teacher makes the mistake in feedback of reformulating the grammar areas which the students found problematic, which seems like a really nice feedback activity, and yes, has its value. Nevertheless, I think there's been a missed opportunity to focus on feedback of the functions of speaking that the students really needed to attend to. In other words, how successful were they in talking about agreement, disagreement, and justifying opinions? There's nothing wrong with the reformulation of grammar, but this, I think, should be a secondary aim, and the reformulation at the end really needs to focus on the speaking aspects of what they did. And then finally, that ABBA single, "Don't Shut Me Down," the gap fill activity, followed by a class debate on the positives and negatives of avatars. This could quite reasonably be used to work with emergent language and an upgrading of the students' lexical range. But for me, that misses the point of a speaking class. I think it's much more useful here to consider the development of and then feedback on, for example, debating skills and the functional language of expressing an opinion and debating. So what I hope I've been able to do in this first part of the presentation is make you aware that a speaking activity can, if you like, be hijacked, and it can become, if we're not careful, a language activity rather than a speaking subskills activity. So in this next part of the presentation, what I want to do is look at how we can learn from test design and the insights that we can get by looking at how speaking tests are developed to reframe what we do in a speaking lesson. Okay, so what we see on the left, man in a suit walking up some stairs, he has a clear objective. He has a goal in mind. And that's going to be the case for our students when they enter exams. Now, I've chosen here a very, very popular exam, specifically at a slightly lower level, the preliminary for schools test developed by Cambridge English at the B1 level. And of course, this covers language, it tests language, it tests reading, listening, writing, and speaking. But what I think is very interesting is if we have a look at the speaking tasks that exist in this test, and they'll be very familiar to many of you. It's a paired exam. Sometimes it might be done in threes if there's an odd number of students on test day. And the interaction patterns are sometimes the interlocutor to the individual candidate. It's the candidate speaking on their own, and then candidate speaking to another candidate in a pair. Now, already what we should be seeing here is that there are different speaking skills required in, say, part 2 of the test, part 3 and part 4. Part 2, the extended turn, requires students to develop the ability to speak at length. And a really nice way, I'm sure you're doing this all already, is to ask the students who are perhaps finding fluency and extended turns difficult to speak in individual sentences and then add them together. So it might be a question response where the response requires the student to say not just what they said first, but what they then said after that. And you're building up a series of utterances, making it longer and longer. What can you see? I can see a dog. What color is the dog? The dog is brown. I can see a brown dog, and so it goes on. But when we start looking at 3 and 4, and indeed everything here, what do candidates have to do? We're given some very nice indications of some of the areas and the functional areas that students need to be able to do for success in this exam. And I think this is a very nice way in to thinking about, at a given CEFR level, what speaking subskills we should be allowing our students to practice, to develop, to learn in our classrooms. Now, of course, when it comes to likes and dislikes, there's a lexical area here. So there may be an overlap with linguistic development. But I think we agree when we're looking at the discussion of alternatives and negotiation of agreement, this is something that is much more a functional area than it is a lexical area. And that's why it's important for speaking skills development. So I'm showing you here the third part of that PET speaking test. And the image that they receive tells them that students from a small village school are going to go on a trip to their capital city. And here are some of the activities they should do there. Talk together about the different activities they could do in their capital city and say which would be the most interesting. And they have 2 to 3 minutes for this. Let me show you the picture that they receive. Now, of course, this is going to require a certain amount of vocabulary. It might be minibus, museum, zoo, tour bus, castle. But that can all be covered in language classes. and indeed should be covered in language classes. What's much more interesting, I think, is what's happening here in terms of the discussion of alternatives and the negotiation of agreement. And that's what I think should be our focus in speaking classes. And indeed, Cambridge helps us by giving us an inventory, effectively, of those functions. So if we just take a minute to think about what sub-skills are required for that particular activity, and you might want to take the opportunity to post into chat some of your ideas. What kind of functional language do you think students need in order to evaluate? I think I've just given you a big clue there, and then decide which of these they want to do on their school trip. So this is what I felt were the key functional areas for speaking. I think they need to be able to express an opinion. And at the B1 level, criticality, I think, should be coming in. They're justifying their opinions. They're explaining why a gallery is boring or a gallery is fantastic because, but also the functions of agreement and disagreement. And these need to be taught. And a speaking class, in my view, is a fantastic time to do it. Now, quite reasonably, you might be thinking, well, what about comparatives and superlatives and that lexis? Well, I'm going to be quite hardline here. And I'm going to suggest that this is developing the speaking skill. This is developing a linguistic skill. There is, of course, an overlap. But if you're in the situation where you are teaching in a context where you have option classes or electives, where speaking is one of them, I would be suggesting this is your main area of interest, and this is perhaps a subsidiary area. I'm certainly not advocating abandoning teaching lexis and necessary grammatical forms where they are directly relevant to the achievement of a task and a speaking task. But I think we should be looking at this primarily. Now, I mentioned that inventory, and this is available to download from the Cambridge English website. It's the Cambridge English Preliminary for Schools Handbook. I know it looks a bit strange that it's .pdf, but I promise you that is correct. And we'll make sure that this is available for you as a download. Now, the point I'm making here is this, and they use the term themselves, an inventory of functions, notions, and communicative tasks. Everything here is linked to these speaking areas. Checking on meaning and intention, restating what has been said, giving advice, paying compliments. And these are all areas that are expected at the B1 level. And therefore, I think a speaking skills class can work a speaking skills teacher rather, can usefully make their way looking at these and building potentially a program that covers these meaningfully. Now, what we have here is the handbook for PET, and indeed PET for schools. But if you go onto the Cambridge Assessment English website, you can download these teachers' handbooks for all of the main exams, including also things like the Business English Beck tests. And I think this is a fantastic resource for teachers to start thinking about how they can make their speaking lessons impactful. Now, I want to make some points here and perhaps summarize what I'm saying. As teachers, therefore, what we need to be doing is making conscious and informed decisions when we are developing our classroom activities for speaking skills. And they should be focusing on what we include and what we exclude. and they should have that clear speaking subskills focus. But there is more. Once we have identified our areas, then we should be providing as teachers directed input of functional language that is appropriate to the needs and level of our learners. You might be wondering, it's been here on screen, what this does not equal mean sign was for. And what it means is if you're teaching a general English test like first certificate, then what you're teaching in terms of the appropriate to needs and levels of your learners will not be the same as the functions and notions and communicative strategies required for a doctor or a nurse who is preparing for the occupational English test, in which, likewise, there is a specific speaking test. Now, quite reasonably, you might say, I'm not preparing my students for an exam. So why should I be interested in, why should I be looking at an inventory for a test? And let me explain and move on to suggest why. But before I do, I'd just like to make one final point in terms of our classroom activities and how we operationalize the development of these speaking subskills in a speaking lesson. And I would suggest that a test, teach, test, or task-based learning framework is probably ideal for this. At higher levels, we might give the students the final task at the beginning of the lesson, see how well they do, give them input on areas that they are struggling with. And remember, our focus here is on the speaking skill, not on the grammatical or the lexical reformulation. Although, of course, this can be included, but as a secondary aim. And then the students repeat a task that has the same outcomes in terms of its testing focus. Or if you feel that deep-ending the students, particularly at lower levels, is not productive, a task-based approach where the students at the beginning of the task actually hear someone or a group of people, it might be an audio recording or a video recording, doing the task, sensitizing the students to the language that they need. They then get the input and then they do the task for themselves. And I think both of these frameworks are really interesting and useful for the development of the speaking skill. But I did promise to make the point about, well, what if you're not teaching exam classes? Is it really necessary to go to the effort of looking at the inventory for the appropriate Cambridge exam for the level of the students that you teach? Actually, personally, I think it is. And the reason for that is that if we're wanting to develop a tool or toolkit for the development of speaking subskills for our students, one of the great things about exams is that what they've done is they've done the hard work for us. Now, course books, of course, include lots of material about speaking practice. Sometimes, to be fair, they dress it up as a speaking activity, as in fact a language activation activity. But nevertheless, there will be discrete speaking elements in any one course book you might choose to take off your shelf. How did the coursebook writers decide what was an appropriate speaking activity at a given level? Because, of course, coursebooks are done at a given level. Well, this is where coursebook and exams have something in common. They are almost all informed by the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, published in 2018. So this is a fantastic resource in order to know what you should expect your students to be able to do at a given level, not just in their speaking, but in fact in any aspect of their language learning. Now, this is a big PDF. It's a very big book. So, of course, course books save us the effort because they have matched the speaking skills in their course books from the framework. But likewise, so have exam boards. Everything here is advised by what you see in the CEFR. However, and this is my final giveaway for this masterclass, there is a fantastic way of finding the information more quickly and more easily, and in fact, in filtering it. Now, what we're looking for effectively are nuggets of gold, those specific speaking skills that we're looking for. And of course, we could go to the CEFR itself. Here is the link across the bottom with the page references. And when we go to the pages, we can see all of them for a given particular speech act. Here it's a sustained monologue describing experiences across a range of levels. But of course, you might only be interested in the B1 areas. Perhaps it's an informal discussion with friends. If you've got teenagers, they're going to go perhaps and study overseas, and you want them at an upper intermediate level to be able to express themselves in an informal discussion. So these are the areas that they need. Again, both taken from the CEFR. But what is really nice is this searchable CEFR descriptor tool. Now, this is a screenshot from the descriptor tool, and basically you can see across the top that it's searchable. By it, you can filter it. You may therefore not be interested in all of the levels. You may be interested in only one of them. You may only be wanting to limit your focus to speaking, not reading, writing, mediation, or whatever. You might also want to look at the particular sub-skill or the scale. So this searchable tool, which is available on the NILE website, enables you to focus down much more on a particular level and a particular area. So this is the spoken production can-do statements from the CEFR, looking at sustained monologue describing experiences. If you think about the sustained monologue that comes up in the IELTS in the long term, it comes up in the Cambridge PET exam in phase 2, but you get a much more manageable list of the functional, notional, communicative skills that the students are required in speaking. So I'm going to suggest, if you want to add variety to your course book, if you want to think about learning outcomes that are speaking sub-skills driven rather than language reformulation or grammar vocabulary review driven, then both the CEFR but also the searchable tool on the NILE website provide really nice ways of accessing this in a way that's easy for you as the teacher to identify what you can be working with, and then potentially developing your own tools and your own resources. So what does this all achieve? Well, I think it means a number of things. We're able to identify the specific sub-skill at a given level. As I've mentioned, we can use this to create lessons that meet the can-do descriptors. And the lessons themselves become much more closely related to the development of the speaking skill. So if we go back to the beginning of the presentation today, and we think about our friends, Yumiko, Elodie, and Francesca, we're in a much better place to give them what they want and what they expect if our lessons are closely aligned with the course objectives, the development of speaking. Yes, this requires additional teacher preparation, both in terms of time and effort. But it does mean that these purposeful, skills-focused lessons are nevertheless within our reach. So as I come to the end of the masterclass today and my conclusions, I'd just like to share with you my headline thoughts that hopefully you can take away with you, but which we can discuss in the live session. So the first one is, speaking skills is a discrete area, and I think there are arguments of treating it as a discrete area. Secondly, it has implications for course design, and I think there are 2 points here. We need to maximize time in speaking classes for speaking sub-skills development. Secondly, we should try to avoid a heavy language skills focus in the majority of our speaking lessons, because then we are doing the students a disservice in developing their speaking sub-skills. Test design, as we've looked at through the example of PET, can help inform understanding for teachers of what principled speaking is made up of, what the notions, the functions, and the communicative strategies look like at a given level, and that the CEFR descriptors can further enhance our understanding of speaking at different levels. Possibly contentious, hopefully controversial, as that always is a great opportunity for a speaking activity. Here I'm providing you with a select reading list that I've used for the preparation of this material. This will also be available in the forum, including that link to the PET handbook, plus the CEFR descriptors themselves. If you are, as I'm sure you are, because that's why you're here today, interested in further developing your professional understanding of being a teacher of English, then the Gallery Teachers Masterclass database, all of the previous recordings are available. This is a fantastic and rich resource, and I'm delighted to be a small part of it. So please go to galleryteachers.com ELT-workshops for a really rich array of training opportunities. A purposeful speaking skills lesson is characterized by what it includes, but also by what it potentially leaves out or at least minimizes. It should always have, in my view, as its primary objective, a clearly identified speaking skills function, for example, as its main aim. And the students are exposed to, have development of, and use of, activation of a particular speaking sub-skills language. So for example, if you're looking at the development of talking about opinions, then the students should be able to, at some point in the class, discuss contentious issues and express their opinions of each other's views. What it should leave out, or at least minimize, is a too much focus on language reformulation of grammar and vocabulary, which is tangential to the actual main aim, discussing opinions. To make sure that your speaking lessons are really focused on teaching speaking, I think there are 2 things that we should be doing. If the lesson comes from a course book, look carefully to see whether, in fact, it's a grammar or vocabulary activation activity. If so, it may not be the best activity for a speaking skills class. You may want to do it as a language development point. If you're developing your own materials, then I think it makes a lot of sense to look at areas of expertise. And by this I mean exams, such as the Cambridge B1 preliminary for schools, or the Common European Framework of Reference, which gives a whole inventory of speaking skills and speaking sub-skills, which can become the focus of our lessons. So sometimes it may feel as if we are reinventing the wheel. We're not. What we might be doing is repurposing the wheel to make sure that it is truly fit for purpose, and therefore that our lesson has a very clear, focused speaking main aim.